friends, and welcome back to yet another Victober video. This is a combination Victober and hashtag Knit and Listen 2019 video. I will link the announcement video down below just in case you didn't see that. Myself and Mel from Mel's Bookland Adventures, Natalie from Curious Reader, and Christy from The Tiny Chronicles are hosting a Knit and Listen along, which Mel came up with a concept, and I thought it was just wonderful, where we're all listening to Adam Bede, and the four of us are hosting different sweaters, but people are also participating with crocheting and quilting and listening along with the audiobook. It is just going to be really neat to see at the end of the month kind of the progress everybody has made on their projects. I am pre-filming this, so I hope to put at some point up an update video about how my knitting has gone. But in honor of Victober, in honor of Knit and Listen, I thought it would be fun to be kind of more informed about knitting during the Victorian era, but also to have kind of the Victober side of things. I did a little research into knitting that is mentioned in Victorian novels, and a lot more came up than I was aware of. I didn't know, how much was going to show up. So I have a whole list written out, and some of them are on my TBR, some of them are ones that I have read, and some of them are ones that I hadn't heard of prior to kind of looking around. I found some really fascinating academic papers on how handicraft is used as plot devices in Victorian novels, which was very fascinating. So some of the books that it's used in is in Vanity Fair. Becky Sharp knits. It seems that Becky Sharp knits when she has nothing better to do and sort of to impress others, not because it's this craft that she has, this deep and abiding love for. Then Sarah Grand is an author I've heard of but have not read her book, The Heavenly Twins, which apparently there is knitting that happens in that. In Far From the Madding Crowd, Bathsheba Everdeen is a knitter. I don't actually remember reading that in the book, so I wanted to reread it anyway. And now that I'm doing this video, I wish I kind of kept an eye out for knitting in any Victorian novel that I read, so I could read you a passage of where they're knitting. Then in Silas Marner, Dolly Winthrop is a knitter. I wish I had read Silas Marner. I haven't read it, but it's on my short list. Then in Miss Marchbanks by Margaret Oliphant, there is some knitting in that. Handicraft is a big part of the plot in that because it contrasts the arts and crafts movement with the design reform movement. The arts and crafts movement was this fad in the Victorian era where it was kind of like, if you're crafting at all, that's all that matters. And so if you're using a printed out, by printing press template, then that's still great because you're still crafting. And then the design reform movement came in and was like, no, we should have our own creativity, kind of have our own ideas and, handicraft that we're creating ourselves. So the art is unique to all of us. It was really interesting to study that a couple of years ago. And I actually did a video a couple of Victobers ago on the arts and crafts movement and the design reform movement as it relates to handicraft, because it is a big topic in Miss Marchbanks by Margaret Oliphant. Then a very interesting way that it's used is by Madame Defarge in The Tale of Two Cities. She puts the names of her hit list, basically, of people who are on her bad list, and she knits them into what she's knitting. I think we're using knit purl stitches. So I actually haven't watched a film version, I think, ever of A Tale of Two Cities. I would be really interested to see if how well they put that, because I think that is a big enough aspect of the plot that it should be put in. So now my mind is reeling and I want to watch a film adaptation of A Tale of Two Cities. Then we have In the Heart of Darkness. Actually, I did not remember this. Apparently the Congolese people are knitters, and it's not portrayed, they're portrayed as such a backwards society. And so I am intrigued. It would be interesting to kind of go back and look at the passages again, because that is something that, in air quotes, if you're just listening, an enlightened person would do. They have the skills and the wherewithal to knit. So it was very showing kind of how backwards their society was, but also their society is supposed to be a big symbol for Victorian society in general. So I'd be really interested in any of you if you have a take on that. Like, what is that supposed to symbolize? If anything, maybe I'm just reading into it and they're just knitting because they're knitting. Next on the list is in Shirley by Charlotte Bronte. The character Shirley knits. Very interesting because she is a woman of independent means, but she still chooses to knit. So it's interesting to see kind of when at a certain point in society it was considered something that well-rounded and cultured young ladies did. More on that later in the video. Then we have in Lady Audley's Secret, Phoebe the Maid. Phoebe the Maid is a fun side character because she is kind of watching and observing everything in this house, and like she's like, what is going on in this house? She doesn't know what to make of everything, but she's really paying attention to all the details. And it's very interesting to see, and I'll definitely look forward to when I reread Lady Audley's Secret, kind of paying attention to what Phoebe's paying attention to. The next book that knitting is mentioned in is Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. Knitting is mentioned in most of Elizabeth Gaskell's books. I don't know if Elizabeth Gaskell herself was a knitter. I don't hear it really referenced in any of her letters, so I'm not sure if she was. I bet I could find something online, and now I want to know. But her character of Mrs. Thornton, so John Thornton's mother, it's noted that actually that in the drawing room there are lace coverlets and doilies like on everything in the drawing room or the parlor, to make it look, that have her touch over the whole house. So it kind of makes her presence known throughout this whole room. She is such a huge presence and a big part of the plot that it makes sense that that would be an element that's going on in this household. And then we see in Middlemarch, Susan Garth is a knitter. So Mary Garth's mother, Mary Garth, who is the love interest of Fred Vincy. And I love Mary Garth. And her mother, we don't get to know quite as well. We do get to know a bit, and there's certain spoilery events that happen that we see kind of more dynamics to her personality, but she's definitely one of the characters more in the background, so it's not one of the main characters per se that's knitting in Middlemarch. And then the book that we are reading in, Adam Bede, I have on my list here that Rachel is a knitter. So by the time you are watching this, maybe we have all gotten to the part of the story where we hear that Rachel is knitting. I'll be really curious. I'm going to definitely keep a lookout for that because I want to, be aware of it and see if it has any ramifications for the plot, or if it's just kind of this little detail that's thrown in there. Also mentioned in Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford, and in Cranford it's mentioned in a very humorous way, where there is a cow that's sunburned, and the owner of the cow is so distressed about her cow getting sunburned, it's like her prized cow, that she knits a whole sunscreen, like a whole full outfit that you put on the cow, and I think it buttons on the bottom so the cow will not be burned. That is true devotion, to knit a cow-sized coverlet. I cannot imagine. So I thought it would be interesting to see kind of the different ways that knitting is mentioned in Victorian novels. Now moving on to sort of the evolution of knitting in the Victorian era. And I did find out some interesting things. The first is that prior to the Victorian era, knitting was a poor woman's craft. It was a poor woman's handicraft that she would just do purely for income. It was not thought of something that was done for pleasure. It was just done out of necessity for income, or keeping feet warm in the wintertime, or hands warm in the wintertime, or heads with hats. So kind of out of necessity. But along comes Queen Victoria to the throne, and she had a deep love for knitting. She loved to knit, and she did also crochet some. And so she kind of changed the idea in society of who knitting was appropriate for. It kind of became a thing that was appropriate for everyone, and refined ladies, if they were going to be a really accomplished lady, as Mr. Darcy would call it, they will know how to knit and possibly crochet and embroider. So it went all the way down, from Queen Victoria to those who were in the workhouse and just poor as poor can be. It was something that all people participated in. So I found that really fascinating, that it was kind of this unifying factor. As much as there was a wealth gap in this time, there was still this kind of handicraft that many people from many walks of life could partake in. Now, Queen Victoria was also a crocheter. Crocheting had only been around for a couple decades by the time Queen Victoria came to the throne, but she did crochet as well. So yes, here's a picture of Queen Victoria knitting, and Princess Beatrice is reading to her from the newspaper, and I just think it's really neat that we're doing knit and listen, and this is what Queen Victoria would do. She would be read to while she knitted. Now, Queen Victoria apparently was not maybe the most skilled of knitters. There is a story where Queen Victoria was visiting a Scottish estate, a friend that she had there. And also staying at this estate was an old woman who was rather hard of hearing. And so when Queen Victoria comes in and is being introduced and greeted by the hostess, the old woman who was staying there wasn't really aware that it was Queen Victoria that was there. Queen Victoria hands her host a pair of hand-knitted socks that she had made herself. And the old woman says, and I quote, "If her man gets no better made socks than that, I pity him." So I thought that was so amusing. She just had no idea that it was Queen Victoria that was there, and she was insulting the Queen of England's knitting. So I will also put in a picture here. This is a scarf that was handmade by Queen Victoria. She made 8 of these, and they were awarded to soldiers who served during the Boer War in South Africa. So I thought this was really neat. This apparently is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London if you want to see something knit by Queen Victoria herself. I was just thinking too, like, I just don't picture modern political leaders today making something by hand and giving it to soldiers in acknowledgement of their service. That was just really funny to picture, for me to picture. So really neat to think about her doing that, though, taking the time to do that. She was kind of, I know people can say she's kind of out of touch because she was so wealthy, but that is something that's genuinely touching to me that she did for soldiers who had served. Just like there's another thing that kind of affected the rise of knitting as becoming as big a craft as it is, and that is the printing press. Knitting patterns were finally readily available for people and so cheap and affordable, and also standard size needles. So in case you are not a knitter and you are watching this, there are different sizes of needles that you can work with, or if you crochet, different sizes of hooks. And the different needles will go from being really, really teeny to really, really big and thick. And that will change the look and the kind of how tightly together your yarn is woven as you're knitting. Prior to that, it probably would have been very hard to make your shawl necessarily look exactly like your friend's shawl because you didn't realize maybe your needles were different sizes. So I am really curious to know too how what knitting needles were made out of first. How did people start making them? And I'm hoping that this Golden Fleece, which I'm hoping to read during Nonfiction November, it's a history of knitting in the British world, will maybe shed some light on that, because I'm very interested kind of to see the evolution of how we've gotten here today with knitting. Then we move on to patterns being readily available. So I'm going to put up some pictures now for you of some Victorian knitting patterns. Now, you may be kind of scratching your forehead wondering, but this does not look very informative. Yes, I would agree with that. These patterns are very sparse and don't have much detail to them. They're just, these ones in particular are just a bunch of symbols, and my eyes feel tired just looking at it. I would think maybe I would want a pen to scratch off each stitch that I did to mark it off so I wouldn't get lost. It looks incredibly intimidating. I do have a theory as to why the patterns were so sparse, and that is that maybe people did handicraft more in community in the Victorian era. I'm particularly thinking of, in the show Lark Rise to Candleford, they live in a teeny tiny hamlet. I mean, we're talking probably 100 people live in this area. Maybe 150 or 200, but it's really small. But they still have a sewing circle, and so women once a week would bring their knitting and their crocheting or embroidery, cross stitch, all of that, and they could kind of give tips and pointers to one another. And the older women who were really experienced and even with tatting, making lace, could kind of give pointers to the younger women. And a young woman, if she was really confused, could maybe ask the older women. That's my theory. I couldn't find anything backing that up, but I just know when I read what I did of Lark Rise to Candleford, it did talk about the women would get together later in the afternoons and the children would all play outside. So I found that really interesting to think about these patterns are so sparse. How did they do it? Maybe Victorian women were just more skilled at kind of figuring out how they wanted to go through a pattern and just needed less information. I'm not really sure. The projects I'm going to show you pretty much look like what I thought they were going to look like. There were a few surprises in there, but lace. The more lace, the more complicated the pattern of lace, the more skilled you were at knitting. So lace was huge with them. They would put lace cuffs on their sleeves. They would make lace doilies to cover everything. Pin cushions, apparently it was common to have like a pin cushion done in every room. And because you never know when you would need a pin cushion, and really elaborate pin cushion designs. This here is a little like sachet purse that's sewn and then has a lace covering on top of it. And it has like a drawstring pouch. So the ribbons and lace, that very much to me looks so Victorian. And so I wasn't that surprised to see that kind of thing. And then we see shawls. Were very, very big. Some of these shawls I really want to make like a Victorian style shawl. It just really appeals to me. I think they're so beautiful. Then I thought it was very interesting to find, I am sharing a couple book covers from pattern books here. And so the first is from Helping the Trawlers, the Royal National Mission to Deep Sea Fishermen. So this was a charitable organization, and there are patterns in here of sweaters that you can make for deep sea fishermen. I thought it was really interesting and kind of neat that people would have special patterns for fishermen because they were out on boats for so long and sometimes in very cold conditions. And so they needed to have garments that would really protect their skin. Interesting trivia fact that I found out too is that, the Guernsey sweaters that fishermen would wear have all sorts of different patterns. They're made on very small needles with wool. And so they were very tightly knit since they're made on the small needles. But they would have different patterns depending on the community that you came from. It is a very morbid reason though. Like if you were from the town of Seabrook, you would have a specific pattern, like all the fishermen would wear the same pattern. And that is because if they found bodies overboard later on, they would know what community to return the body to. So it's very sad, but also at the same time, very useful. Hopefully less, hopefully less fishermen where they, just never returned the bodies home. So really sad, but a really smart system that was made. Then the Mother's Knitter, the Ladies Knitting Book. And so then I've also inserted a pattern for a gentleman's sock. So you can take a look at this. And these are, the instructions are so sparse. Fingering worsted needles, number 16, cast on 96 inches. I won't read the whole thing, but it's just, I can't imagine figuring out how to turn a heel. Have you ever made a sock? My first sock that I made, a wonderful YouTube channel called Pink Knits, and she had this deal where you could buy a sock pattern, and then as part of the deal, there was a video she had up for each step. I cannot imagine having turned the heel without knitting with someone with me or watching those videos, because turning the heel is so stressful. So yeah, it just says divide for the heel, divide up the stitches, and then knit 3 inches in length and pick up the side stitches and knit the gusset. So it doesn't really give much more detail. Many of these did not have pictures. I really had to search to find the pictures that I'm showing you. So I think it was the general trend at first that you didn't necessarily need a pictorial guide, but also the camera was relatively new. So maybe we have this idea that we need pictures for everything, but you don't necessarily. I'm not sure. Then there's the Home Knitter, a manual for making useful articles for the family. And then some of these, the crossover in particular, I would actually really like. I don't know, I think just wearing it under a jacket could be nice. These all look so Victorian to me. The cape, the muff, the crossover, like I said, it just looks very cozy. So I guess maybe you put a button on it and it fastens it. The vest and a petticoat. I didn't know women would wear like that thick of petticoats, but I guess for winter it would be nice. Then it's interesting to see certain companies, as they do now, put out their own knitting ones. So this is from Florence Etching Silk, and it says they are prepared expressly for art designs and outline. And what I love is the special notice on the bottom. It says, in order that our customers may not be deceived, the style of ball in which Florence knitting silk is sold is shown in our engraving. Observe that the brand Florence is stamped in each spool. Also the number 300 on the coarser silk and the number 500 on the finer. Imitations in similar style are in the market, but under other names. The Florence is positively the only silk suitable for knitting which will bear washing without injury to color or texture. So there's some heavy marketing going on there. And then you can see a knitted lampshade. Who does not want a knitted lampshade? I thought the silk purse, the opening of it looked really interesting. It looks kind of like a hot water bottle to me. So I don't know precisely how exactly you fit things in this silk purse. So it would be really fun actually to kind of experiment if you had the time that you wanted to dedicate to make some of these things and see how practical you actually think they are. Fancy silk mittens with a lovely ribbon on them. So yeah, just fun to see all of these different covers. Then we see the brioche petticoat. I was intrigued to see that the brioche stitch was a thing in the Victorian era. I would love to know like how different stitches came about, but I love how the brioche stitch looks. And then we have several items made for little babies. And my favorite item that I happened upon, are you ready for it? It is a pair of knitted reins for a child. So all of you judgy people out there who think that children shouldn't be on leashes, you like don't have a child that age. I'm just thinking about when I am out with Arthur, if we're anywhere near the street, I'm like gripping his hand so tightly the whole time we're near the street. They have no street sense, no common sense. And sometimes a leash, you know, it's just a nice thing to have as insurance so that they don't get away. What my favorite part though about these reins are the bells on the front. So they're like a kitty cat or a cow. So you know where they are if somehow you let go of these reins. Anyhow, I just thought that was so funny. Going along with more of these sparse instructions are the how to begin to knit. I don't know if I would have any idea whatsoever how to begin to knit after reading these instructions. It doesn't really show what actually happens during the knitting. But again, I was spoiled. I was taught the knit stitch by my sister-in-law in person. She sat right there with me and I practiced and practiced by her. I hope you enjoy learning a bit more about Victorian knitting. It's definitely intriguing me more. So I really am looking forward to reading this Golden Fleece next month during Nonfiction November. And I am really, really wanting to make a crossover now. Like I said, I don't know, you know, when it actually came down to it, how often I would wear it. I'd have to see what it was like to wear it if it seemed like, oh, this is so comfy, or if it seemed too bulky. That is all I have to say for this video. I will be back for another Victober video soon. Happy reading and happy knitting, crocheting, embroidering, cross-stitching, quilting, whatever handicraft you are doing.